So let us begin. My name is Morag, if we've not met before, and this is Wild and Kind Wednesday. I'm calling in from the unceded lands of the Gunnarkurnai down in East Gippsland in Australia at the moment. And it's my absolute delight to welcome to our Wild and Kind Wednesday, Pippa Chapman. Now, Pippa and I met, many years ago now, Pippa, and at a permaculture event, but had connected before that through a podcast conversation around her first book. So Pippa is a permaculture gardener, designer, educator, author. She has 2 books, which hopefully people will be able to tell us about a bit. She also runs a food forest circle, and she's a trained horticulturalist and gardener through RHS system. So Pippa has been a passionate gardener. Sorry, I'm keeping on looking over here to let everyone in. Everyone's just flooding in right now, which is great. So Pippa has been a passionate plant person for decades. My kind of person, Pippa. It's lovely to see where you're all calling in from. Thank you for introducing yourself. It's great to see people from all around the world here. I love the fact that these Wild and Kind Wednesdays are really interactive. So it's like a live podcast with a chance to be in conversation with our guests. Welcome, Pippa. It's so great to have you here for our Wild and Kind Wednesday. We've been going all June, and now we're halfway through July, and we only have 2 more after this. So it's so great that you're here with us. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me. Yeah, it's really it's such a privilege to be part of this series of conversations. I've been listening and really enjoying them myself. So yeah, really great to be here.
So Pippa, before we opened up the session, we were having a little bit of a chat about what's going on in your part of the world at the moment. So perhaps you could just let people know where you're calling in from, and just maybe a little bit of an overview of what's going on with the heat waves in your part of the world.
Yeah, well, so I live in West Yorkshire in the UK. And normally we are quite a kind of damp, rainy part of the UK, very green and lush, never have to really worry about watering. At the moment, we are going through a very extreme heat wave. So we've had red heat warnings for us here. And in some parts of the world that, a temperature of 30 degrees might be your normal and that's fine. But in the UK, we're not set up for these kinds of temperatures. And I was just explaining to Morag when we first got on our call that I've actually got insulated foil taped to the outside of my windows, because my house, I have huge windows that face south. And if I don't put anything on them, the house just heats up like an oven, and it's totally unbearable to be in. And actually I saw some pictures yesterday which showed, because we've had these heat waves, we're in July now, and we've had 3 heat waves in the last 3 months, which is just unprecedented for us. And actually, even from space, you can see the difference between the grass being green, the landscape being green, and now slowly turning brown. And actually, just last night, we had a fire on the moors just not very far from our house. And, normally the moors here would just not really be quite dry enough to have a fire just start by accident. So, over the whole country, there have been several wildfires. And we have water collection systems here. We have 7 water butts. We have 2 big 1,000-litre tanks, and they've been empty for weeks because we had to use them, straight away. And normally I don't have to water any perennials in the ground, just my annual vegetables. But even the perennial plants are starting to really suffer from drought, and it's just not what we're used to in this part of the UK at all.
No, so I mean, it was really quite disturbing when I saw that you had fires in your part of the world. It really does feel unprecedented.
Yeah.
So our conversation today, Pippa, just for those of you who are here, is focusing around food forests, forest gardens, mini food forests, particularly looking at small scale ones that we can integrate anywhere where you are, whether it's in a small backyard or a small urban plot. But I guess perhaps we could begin just as a segue from what you've been talking about to introduce this concept of food forests in a way that responds to these sort of the extremes of climate and why it's so important that we actually do start to really look at these sorts of food systems as a way to build in resilience and food security.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even last year we had a 3 months with no rain in the spring, which is, as I say, it it isn't like normal for this part of the world. Maybe it's starting to become the norm. But what I really noticed was that the areas of, we have some annual vegetable beds, some more traditional style beds for growing vegetables here. At my house, we have a back garden, quite a large back garden. And we have about a third of it is food forest, a third of it is a giant polytunnel, and a third of it is annual vegetables. And it was really noticeable how much the annual vegetables needed to be watered. They've got less of an extensive root system, particularly earlier in the year, and there's a lot more bare soil until they really fill out. And so they needed a lot more water, whereas the food forest itself, it fared absolutely fine last year, even through 3 months of no rain, everything looked fine. It was starting to get a little bit crispy around the edges at the end of the 3 months, but it just showed to me what a resilient system it was, that it had managed to cope with such dry conditions, even though that isn't the norm for our area, and still produce abundant crops the whole time, whereas a lot of the annual vegetables, even with watering, they kind of struggled along. And we've also had really sort of very wet winters here as well. And so whereas some of the annual vegetable beds, some of the vegetables just rotted or got completely, we sort of had a plague of slugs one year where even perennial plants were getting eaten that they wouldn't normally touch. And so the annual vegetables, it was almost impossible to grow anything, whereas the food forest just carried on as normal. Things just grew. The perennial plants are so much stronger because they have this really strong root system. So if a slug comes along and eats off all the shoots off the entire plant, it's still got the energy to just push up some new shoots. Whereas if it does that to a vegetable seedling, that's it, you've got to start again.
I wonder too whether you're noticing around with the layering of the food forest that the canopy layer is actually really helping to keep cooler underneath the soil, and whether you've been monitoring that, or observing what's going on there.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a way, it's sort of almost like the canopy layer, but also the ground cover layer are almost the two most important, because the ground cover layer is really important for keeping the soil cool. And we had quite a hot heat wave in May, so quite early in the year for some of the annual vegetables. And I went out to pick some lettuce, which hadn't got very big yet. So there was still quite a lot of bare soil. And I just put my hand on the soil so that I could lean over and pick something. And I was amazed that the soil was so hot that I couldn't bear to keep my hand on it. And, it was just crazy. I couldn't understand how the plants hadn't cooked alive. Whereas when I went into my food forest to pick a few things, the soil was lovely and cool because it had this ground cover layer on, as well as the canopy layers creating a bit of shade as well. So I think, it's a balance between having both of those two layers, keeping the soil covered, keeping it cool, creating shade. We bought our house a few years ago because we had previously lived in a really shady north facing slope, and so we wanted somewhere really, really sunny. And now we're almost slightly regretting buying such a sunny garden because none of our trees are very big yet, so there is really nowhere that I can go and sit in my garden at the moment that is shady, because all of my trees are still, sort of knee high, waist high, and they're not providing any shade yet. So I'm really looking forward to when they get big enough to cast a decent amount of shade.
Well, you were talking as well before we started about this idea of creating sort of pergolas off the side and
Mm,
maybe, constructing something in your garden that creates shade that could be a trellis or a pergola or,
mm,
some sort of fast growing pioneer species could do that work. I know that, in the subtropics, that's something that I have to think about. If I don't have cover, I burn very quickly. My skin gets dreadfully susceptible, and also all the plants and the soil does. It's just absolutely essential. So I wonder what might be some of the things that you're using as a ground cover that is keeping the soil cool in your part of the world. What are some of the
mm.
species?
Yeah, it's been really interesting actually. When I did a YouTube video about ground covers, and it was interesting how some of the ground covers that I use, like Bugle, the Ajuga reptans, I use that quite a lot. It's really effective where I am in this part of the world as a ground cover. It really successfully covers the ground, keeps it cool, has beautiful flowers for bees. But quite a few people have said, "Oh, that's a really terrible invasive where I live, and you should never plant it in your garden because it might escape out into the countryside and start taking over." So it's been really interesting actually to chat with people about which plants work in different parts of the world. But so I particularly like that. I also like alpine strawberries so long as they're fairly contained because they can get a bit rampant. But I find that alpine strawberries, I've had them where they almost look dead because they've shriveled up in the heat. And then as soon as we get a bit of rain, they just seem to rehydrate and carry on. So they've been really good. I've had things like a Viola sororia, which is fantastic because I love eating the flowers in salads and the leaves. They kind of really got a really kind of cooling effect on the gut and everything as well. So, and they form a really dense mat. And even the Serbian bellflower, Campanula postcheskayana, and that is great because it grows in the sun, it grows in the shade, it kind of forms a really dense mat. So there's just no room for any weeds to come up. There's no, it keeps the soil really moist, and yet you can eat the flowers, you can eat the leaves, and it's evergreen, so you can eat it all through the winter. And so I don't necessarily need to have a huge like range of different plants that I use. I have sort of maybe those are the main ones that I will use in different gardens because I know that they have multiple functions. They're not just ground covers, but they're edible as well, and even things like clover that are nitrogen fixing.
I think what would be really lovely is anyone who's here, who's a plant person too, and is doing this kind of thing, to write in the chat what it is that you use as a ground cover, but also say where you are,
Yes.
because it really does depend, doesn't it? And like you're saying,
Mm.
what's really great for you could be a weed somewhere else. And so just if you're doing this, yeah, please do share. That would be wonderful. Um, Someone's just asked if it's possible to have just me and Pippa on the screen. Yes, the answer that Lisa said, you can change your view up the top. You can change so that it's just speaker view. That's in your control. So hopefully you can work that out. There's a gallery view or speaker view. Yeah. So some of the things that I use are, I have nasturtiums growing all over underneath all the citrus trees, and they just make this beautiful thick mat that collects the water and trickles that down. Sweet potatoes, things like that, are just covering over underneath. And also, what I find too is some really beautiful, dense perennial greens like Suriname spinach or Brazilian spinach and those sorts of plants. And what I like to do too is create little mosaic plantings in amongst the forest garden area, is to plant some of the annuals because in the middle of summer it is so baking hot outside. So I
Mm.
wonder, how do you think you might adapt what you're doing now to tend to these sort of really quite extreme temperatures? How do you feel that you might change what you're doing with your vegetable gardening to make it more resilient?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think the thing with climate change that maybe we didn't think about a decade ago when we just thought, oh, it's just going to get hotter, so we'll plant plants that like hotter weather, was the fact that, particularly where we are, is we get wetter as well.
Yeah.
So I would love to say, oh, I'll plant loads of drought tolerant plants in my garden, but actually that's not necessarily going to work because we're getting much wetter winters as well. So then things just rot in the ground. So how I'm adapting, I suppose, is I'm planting a range of plants. So I'm planting some things that like drier conditions, some things that like wetter conditions, and seeing what survives really. And also it's been interesting to see what will survive both extremes, what plants are going to be able to cope with that wet weather, but also the dry weather. And so that, yeah, that's been a bit more of a challenge really, is trying to work out how to manage those two
Yeah.
extremes, that we're not really used to such big extremes here.
And I think you're right. It's a sort of a moment of experimentation, isn't it? It's like, okay, let's try a lot of different things and
Mm,
watch and play and experiment and just keep observing. And in each microclimate, we're going to find different things that work. And so just being it's okay to, some things will fail, but some
mm,
things that might surprise you that you hadn't thought of before. And I think it's really good to have an opportunity to be able to talk to people in your area as well about, oh, how are you adapting to this? What are you using? So um, I know you have a food forest circle. Can you tell us a bit about that and how you're trying to create these spaces where people can really chat about how they're going to do this, because it's something that could be new for people, but it's also something of responding to changes that are happening that we have to address. So,
yeah.
it's a community learning process,
It
isn't it?
it absolutely is, and I always say whenever I'm teaching about food forest design, I always say to people it's about experimentation, because even as a very experienced designer and someone who's been growing food forests for over 15 years, I can't say, well, I know exactly what's going to grow well, because every garden is different, every soil is different. Two plants that grow really happily together in my garden, I could plant those somewhere else. And because of the slight change in microclimate, in soil, one might prefer those conditions and be really vigorous, and the other one struggles. So suddenly that dynamic that works really well in my garden doesn't work at all in that other garden. So it is so much about experimentation. And that was partly why I set up the Food Forest Circle, because what I love is just chatting to other people who are growing and experimenting with food forests. And it's really a great space for anyone, whether they're a really experienced grower or a complete beginner, because we can all learn something from each other. And it's lovely. There's people from, all over the world in there as well. So I find it really interesting to, I make a lot of habitat within my food forest. For me, a food forest is just as much about creating space for other insects, animals, creatures, wildlife to share a food forest. It's not just about growing food for me. I want to share all of that. And so I make a lot of things like log piles and dead hedges. And there's people sort of saying, oh no, I could never do that because of the fire risk, or even put down a wood chip mulch as a mulch because of fire risk. And interestingly, actually, yesterday I was just having a conversation with a friend because of the wildfires that were nearby, and she was saying, "Oh, actually, it's really made me think that I have these log piles, I have these dead branches, and I have a really dry, crispy meadow now where everything's just dried up." And that's right up to my front door. So actually, should I be leaving a kind of fire belt of trimmed short grass just in case? And it's interesting because it's not something that I had thought about before, chatting with people in the food forest circle and sort of understanding those differences in how you approach habitat creation or food forest management in different climates and different areas of the
Yeah,
world.
that's so important, isn't it? I mean, it really makes me think about this whole, the permaculture zones and really thinking about, well, how do you tend to food forests in different zones, and how do you tend
Mm,
to that sort of the wildlife habitat creation in the different zones as well? Like what happens out in your zone 5 or 4 area might be quite different from what's right up next to your house, and really thinking too differently, about the space, the winds, where the fires are coming from, whether there's any kind of water body, what other kind of strategies you've got in place. We're even starting to sort of think about having sprinklers on the roof, or pumps from the dam to spray, like really quite significant chunky fire strategies. And I know there's people here on this call who have lost their house in the middle of bushfires, and I'm sure they've got lots of really great ideas of how to do that. But it's a really important thing, how to bring in these sort of complex, diverse, woody kind of food systems at the same time as responding to climate change and these droughts that we're facing. So it's a really, really, it's a lot to think about, and it's a lot to hold. So perhaps you could walk us through maybe how you work with people to take them step by step. Like, what do you say when people are just beginning? How would you encourage them to start thinking about this?
Yeah, well, I always follow the permaculture design process. I think I do it very step by step, because for me, I think that's the best way, particularly for beginners, to break the whole process down. It feels quite scary sometimes at the beginning, because you're thinking, I don't know where to put anything. I don't know what I want to plant. And then once I planted it, I don't know how to manage it. And it can all seem, quite overwhelming. So I start at the very beginning, and usually when I'm doing my community designs, or I'm teaching a course, I actually sit everybody down and we just have some paper and magazines and pens and scissors and glue, and it just sort of it breaks that feeling of design being a very technical thing. So we start off with cutting and sticking, and really it's about just getting an idea of what you want from your food forest. So what do you want to concentrate on food? Do you want to concentrate on medicinal crops? Are you wanting to concentrate on habitat? There's, like, we call it a food forest, but there's so many different ways in which we can concentrate on that. So everybody's food forest looks totally different. For some people, it's really important that it looks beautiful and it's full of color and flowers. For other people, they want it to be like super practical and just to be able to harvest as much food as possible. And for other people, they want to give the majority of the crop to the wildlife, and they're just happy to pick a few berries every now and again. So everybody's food forest looks completely different. And I think sometimes by talking about that, it helps people to not feel like they're doing it wrong, because I think there's sort of a feeling of, this is what a food forest is meant to look like, and what if mine doesn't look like that? Or, I've even had people saying, well, I can't fit all the 7 layers in, so does it still count as a food forest? And I say, well, of course, because food forests are all about taking the concept of the layers. The layers is a way to break down the natural ecosystem into a pattern that we can then sort of take, and it makes sense to us, because the ecosystem of a forest is so complex. We couldn't possibly just look at it and copy all of that. So somebody's handily broken these down into different layers and different guilds and different functions of plants, so that it helps us to understand it. But if you create a planting and it's got 5 of the 7 layers, that's still a food forest. Even if you just had trees, herbaceous plants and ground cover, to me that's still a food forest. It doesn't need to have all 7 layers. You don't need to tick every box for it to count as a food forest. And so I think by starting off by saying, actually, there aren't rules like that. Food forests are a concept. They're about taking inspiration from nature. They're not about ticking boxes and sort of saying this is or this isn't a food forest. And I suppose because I work on a different scale to some people who do sort of agroforestry, and so you do have to do things differently, because we can't grow in the same way in a small backyard or in a small community space, or even in a planter on a balcony. We can't grow in that same way. So you have to adapt and not be too rigid in how you approach food forests.
Yeah, beautiful. I want to ask you a bit too about these tiny food forests, and food forests that are perhaps things that are not maybe community food forests in tiny spaces. Have you played in that space, and maybe have you got some examples to share of that, or maybe even also a food forest on a balcony, someone's balcony food forest? What might that look
Yes.
like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can fit a dwarf fruit tree, some alpine strawberries, a lemon balm, and even a Herbaceae, Caucasian spinach to grow up some trellis. You can fit that all in a planter, and you've still got lots of layers. You're still using a perennial system. If you're mulching the pot and you're chopping and dropping and then you're still taking inspiration from nature, growing in all these different ways in a perennial system, and you can put that in a small pot. Obviously, that's going to take more management than where it's growing in the ground outside, where the roots can get their own moisture. But I think it's still, in my eyes, it's still a really great way to grow, and it's still a really great way to practice permaculture, even if you don't have a big space. In terms of community gardens, I used to do a lot of setting up, I don't know how it works in different areas of the world, but in the UK, there's a really frustrating funding model where you get money to set something up, and then the money just finishes after maybe a year or two, and then the project usually fails because it's very hard to keep the community involved in the long run when there isn't the finances to support a worker to come along and manage that project. And so you create raised beds, you plant loads of annual vegetables, and then they get harvested. And then if there's no one to come along and plant them again the next year, they just get abandoned, and it all falls apart. And it feels like a very frustrating waste of time. So I actually stopped getting involved in any projects like that years ago because it just felt like it didn't fit in with how I wanted to work. And I didn't think it was beneficial to the community either, because you get everyone really excited, they buy into this project, they come along, they get involved, and then they just see it fail, and it's very frustrating. Whereas when I started creating community food forests with groups, after a year or two of input, of sitting with the community, working out what their needs are, how we can meet those needs with the plants that we put in, planting them, having a year of learning how to manage that site, the plants pretty much looked after themselves, and the community just come along and harvest, a little bit of pruning here and there, a little bit of mulching. But the whole point is that these food forests are designed to pretty much look after themselves. And I have helped to go and run sessions on food forests where, for one reason or another, they were neglected for sort of maybe 3, 4, 5 years. And you just come along with some secateurs, you prune back some overgrown climbers and do a bit of pruning on some fruit trees and some shrubs, and maybe plant a couple of herbaceous plants in where they've got smothered out, and you have a functioning food forest again, and I think it's so much more resilient to meet the needs of the community, in terms of the varying degrees of input that community spaces can get. Sometimes there's a really great group that kind of work really well together and then something happens, someone has caring responsibilities or health issues, or we have a financial crisis and everybody's working 3 jobs and they don't have time. But those systems, they just keep growing, without any issues, and they're just much more resilient space, and so much better for wildlife as well. I always explain to people how creating that kind of permanent structure of trees and shrubs and plants that are covering the ground, instead of annual gardens where you're just taking everything away from and leaving bare soil, then in all these community settings, there's a real boost to wildlife and biodiversity as well.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've seen that in your garden, and I know for sure I've seen that in my garden, both the wildlife habitat that's there, but also how little I actually need to tend it now. Like sometimes I feel a little bit guilty how little I'm doing in it, because it just has its own thriving nature, and there's all these other creatures that are gardening in there too now, like the wallabies trim the sweet potatoes that are coming across, and the scrub turkeys in there cleaning up some of the stuff underneath the food forest. Like there's all these co-gardeners in this space, which is really, it's wonderful. But I think this idea that you're talking about of creating more food forests in the middle of cities and towns and wherever we are. So it's not like we have to have a big site. It's not like we have to even have a big backyard of our own.
Yeah.
Wherever we are, there is a possibility that we can create this. And it's not just necessarily the habitat or the food. It's also nurturing community and well-being, and just that sense of groundedness and something. I know something happens inside me when I enter into a food forest. There's a sort of a sense of spaciousness and like I just feel like I can breathe out. And there's that sense of like, oh gosh, there's food and life everywhere. You enter into a space that is alive, and that does something to you inside, I think. And yeah, I wonder, what's your experience been of that type of that dimension of food forest, what you've talked with communities about, or other reasons that people say, I love food forests because of this?
Well, it was interesting. I did a project a couple of years ago now called Keighley Green Vision, and the town where I live in Keighley in West Yorkshire. We are very lucky that we have, it's not a huge town, but we have 5 or 6 big green parks. So we have quite a lot of green space in our town. And mostly it's just grass and some big trees, and there's not really much diversity there. And I was running a project, and it was about, it was inspired by Rob Hopkins. So his kind of look at if you create a vision of what somewhere could be, even if it seems impossible, that just actually having that vision to look at means that people are more likely to try and work towards that because they've seen the possibility of what it could be. And so it's easier to make it happen. And so as part of this green vision, I was going around the different community groups, going to different community events and chatting to people about food growing and what were the main barriers to food production in the town. And actually most people said, even if I had an allotment, even if I had a large garden, I wouldn't have the time to tend a vegetable garden. It would not fit into my life. I don't have time to do that. And so the more that I chatted with them about what a food forest was, how much less work it was, how kind of nature did most of the work, and once you'd kind of put in the first year or two of hard work getting it established, it more or less looked after itself. It was like this this idea of these community food forests all over our town, in all of our parks, in all of our public spaces, so that when people were struggling, we have food banks in the UK, so that if you can't afford to buy food, then you can go to food banks and someone will give you some food. But it's never fresh food. It's never like the most nutritious food. It's just usually the cheapest food, because that's how the food bank can feed the most people. So the idea that you could go out and pick fresh raspberries or fresh apples or some fresh coriander, to make a really nutritious meal for your family, and that all of that was within your public space, within the town, just felt like this really special vision for a town which has all sorts of antisocial problems. It's it's one of the most deprived areas in the whole of the UK. But by creating these community food forests, what a special environment that could feel like, where kids on their way to school could just be picking things from the park, to eat on the way there. And so, yes, I absolutely understand that feeling of going, when I step into my own garden, and it just is such a lovely feeling to be able to pick enough food to feed us for that evening. And I know some people have criticized sometimes food forests for just being green leaves, well, we can't survive off green leaves. But actually, it's not like that at all. We can grow all sorts of grains and root crops and things to sustain us, 12 months of the year from our food forests if we design them well. And I just think, what an amazing vision if I don't want to start going into wild spaces and planting cultivated crops. But if we look at gardens and our green parks and urban spaces, imagine if all of them were these super abundant, biodiverse food forests, it would just be such an amazing place to walk through.
Yeah, I really love that kind of what if, like what Rob Hopkins talks about all the time, like speaking with communities about, well, what if, what are our what ifs, what do we dream, what do we imagine? There's a couple of questions that I want to ask you about that, because those dreams to have food forests everywhere, I walk through landscapes all the time with my garden coloured glasses on, and I see the possibilities. I'm, always a food possibilitarian. And then sometimes you sort of come up into the thing of, but we don't have the policy for that yet. Or so I wonder, what have you been able to do so far, and what have you not been able to do? What are the ways that we can navigate those challenges when we encounter them?
Yeah, I mean it is a struggle. I think I've had in the past, I've had some interesting conversations with our local council where they more or less said, yes, do whatever you want. You can have, just ask us about a different green space and we'll say yes or no. We're really open to it.
Right.
And that's great. But then it's like, well, where does the funding come from? Where does the support, other than just saying, yes, you can use this green space? It's difficult for me on my own to garden the entire town and create these green spaces. So actually, our local council have been fairly positive about helping to make that happen. They've been really positive about that. But at the moment, until I can get a few more people on board, I've got a community. It's a bit like an outdoor community centre just down the road. So there's about 25 social enterprises, and we all share this community garden. And so I set up a forest garden club there. And so that's where I thought, well, I'll start by teaching skills. I'll start by teaching more people about food forests, getting some more interest, and creating a group of people who might be more interested in sort of, once we've created this food forest here, and I have a model within Keighley for people to come and look at, people from the council can come and see, people from the community can come and see. And when people see what it is, because I know I've got this amazing picture in my head, but most people have never seen a food forest and they have no idea what I'm talking about. They can come and see it, and then hopefully we can kind of expand from there, start small and just build and build and build. So I think that whole small and slow solutions of permaculture, that fits so well into most things in life. So I've decided to start small and try and work my way out. So now we've got it's only just been planted late last year, so it's less than a year old food forest growing now, just down the road from me. That that now I can start bringing people and explaining to them and showing them, and hopefully that interest will grow. And particularly, thinking about food security, and we're having those conversations. I run a Keighley Green get together once a month, so people come together and we chat about green issues, how we can make Keighley more resilient. We had recently had conversations around if our food system as we know it collapsed, how could Keighley feed itself? So sort of by introducing those ideas and those conversations, we can start to kind of make a bit of a plan. And
That's
so
so
I
cool.
feel,
Yeah.
yeah, it was really interesting, and even we're hoping to start a seed library as well, because we recognised that even if we had all of the green space that we needed to grow food, that actually one of the first things when lockdown happened, one of the first things we ran out of in the UK was vegetable seeds. So you couldn't, even if you wanted to grow food, you couldn't because everywhere had sold out really quickly. And so we identified that as actually being the first hurdle. So the first hurdle is we need our own seeds to be a truly resilient community. We need our own seeds. So that's what we're starting with. So we're trying to start small and build up. And I think that's the best way to try and do anything really, particularly if you're doing it from a grassroots level. And I've chatted with people before about even if your council are not supportive, actually the amount of energy it takes to try and fight the system can sometimes be just so exhausting and you get nowhere, that actually what you need to do is build a parallel system. So you're not working against the council, you're just kind of working alongside them, but without needing their permission. You're just building your own system. And so that's kind of what we're doing. Not that we have to fight with the council, they've actually been fairly helpful, but just this idea that the whole grassroots level, rather than fighting, actually put that energy into creating something entirely different.
Yeah, that's so beautiful.
Working.
There's so many things that you just said there. Just as a quick flash summary, that there's you're doing education because you're recognizing that part of that is a really important part, that creating demonstration, like models, starting small, doing social events, having a garden club. Because Dora in the chat was saying she struggles with gathering a committed community. And so, you were saying, we don't need to start with the seeds, but, maybe, we need to start by gathering the community too. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the, as well as that, building the relationships with the council and building friendships. And so, I know starting Northeast Street City Farm, community garden and food forest, that was a lot about nurturing the community, like opening events that were inviting people from the local restaurants and cafes and the local garden stores and the local councillors and people up and down the street, and just opening up for a feast in the park, and that was our way of getting things started. I wonder what you've found is a great way to just bring people together. What's been a starting point? Yeah.
It's something that I've been doing for many years. It must be, around 12, 13 years now that I've been working in the kind of community food growing area. And I think time and time again, what I find is that it's much more productive when I can go and meet people in their own space rather than expecting them to take time out of their busy lives to come along to me. So quite often I will go to other events that are already organised, and I will have a table just explaining, just chatting to people, having conversations, gathering contact details if they're interested, going to schools, going to organisations. And I just find that works so much better, because it is really hard, I think even harder now than before COVID, to get people to come to events. I find it really challenging. So if I can go along to things that are already happening, or I go and give talks to gardening groups, I just find that works so much better than me trying to bring people to me, to something new that they don't know anything about. And why would they want to come? If they don't know anything about forest gardens already and they've never heard of it, if I have a big forest garden event, why would they want to come? Because they don't even know what it is. If I can go to, a parent and toddler group and just have a chat with people about what a food forest is, or if I can go and talk to a gardening group who they've never even heard of permaculture and sort of introduce these new concepts, then that has a lot more impact, I think, going to see people who maybe never even thought they wanted to know about forest gardening or permaculture or any of these concepts. I think it's better to go and meet people in a place that they already feel comfortable than have them, that's a good way to start anyway. That's what I've found.
Yeah, and that's integrate rather than segregate too. That's exactly it. It's like people are people doing lifing things, and where are people doing that might be open to. I think that's such a beautiful approach. I was just inviting too for people to drop into the chat, other ideas that they've had about ways to build and nurture community to activate these kind of projects, because I think it's something, you were talking earlier about, there's, things get started and then, they fall over. And that's because, maybe they had a whole lot of funding thrown at them to start with. And when the funding drops, I mean, I've seen that pattern over and over and over again here as well. I mean, what I find too is it's that slow, deep approach about connecting, building relationships, taking it one step at a time. And I find that you end up being able to go much further quicker than you imagine, but by starting with that really slow, gentle, it's that sort of the wild and kind part, like how do you open up to sort of who you thought perhaps not even imagine was be interested before, and then just take your time and really build relationships. And I think that to me is something that really has helped a lot. I'm really grateful for everyone who's dropping their thoughts in the chat there as well. So in terms of what you're doing with the Food Forest Circle, what have you seen have been some of the core questions that people are asking, or some of the really surprising or interesting places people are doing food forests?
Yeah, well, it was really fun actually. We kicked off the membership with a guild, a Food Forest Guild challenge, and that was really interesting because I think people had this idea in their head. I mean, you see it a lot on social media and like, oh, there's a guild. This is what an apple tree guild looks like. Like that's the only plants you can plant with an apple tree. So I think it was just this, people just really loved the freedom of, I know actually you can plant, pretty much whatever you like. Here are the parameters of actually you want some, ideally a nitrogen fixing plant or two. You want some things to attract in pollinating insects. But, actually, does your tree need to be a fruit tree? Not necessarily. Maybe you want it to be a tree for pollinators. That's also fine. I think one thing that people really responded to, I think, was just taking down those barriers and just saying, well, you can plant a successful guild around something that isn't even a fruit tree. If it's a tree that has some kind of purpose for whatever you're wanting, great. Doesn't have to be an apple tree. So I think that's been really interesting. And I think just sharing the fact that it's okay that things die, that it's fine, even as a professional, I have things that die, and that's fine. And I don't feel bad about it. I don't feel like I failed. I feel like I tried it. It wasn't quite right for that area, for whatever reason. Maybe because it got totally drenched in the winter and then frazzled in the summer. I can't have predicted that. It's fine, we just then can try something else. And actually, what I like about food forests is that you can just keep experimenting all the time and you can change your mind. And one year you might decide that you want loads of lemon balm and you're just really excited to plant it everywhere. And then 3 years later, you just absolutely sick to death of lemon balm and you want to dig most of it out and plant something else in. And that's fine. I think it's just been it's been nice to chat with people who've sort of said, oh, I thought maybe I wasn't very good because I keep trying to grow rosemary and it keeps dying, and actually now I've realized it's not my fault. It's just it's not the right plant for my garden. So I think that's been the nicest thing. And I think as well, a lot of what I do, it's really important that it looks beautiful as well. And I think for a long time when I first got into permaculture, there was this real feeling like that it didn't matter almost that what it looked like. It felt like it had to be edible, it had to be practical, it had to serve some function, and that how it looked wasn't important. That was how it felt at the time. Obviously, that was because I was new to permaculture and I just hadn't realized that actually beauty was a yield and joy was important. And so I think because my background before that was ornamental horticulture, and my before I got into gardening, I was an artist. It's just been really freeing to be able to bring that kind of beautiful side of gardening to food forests. And I think that has actually made it more appealing to more people. People have sort of said to me, oh, well, I didn't think food forests were for me. And then I saw some pictures of some of your food forests and I thought, oh my God, that's what I want in my garden. And so I've taken it up and so it's lovely. People share photos of what they're doing in the chats, in the community. And it's just, I get so much inspiration from that. There's a fellow YouTuber who she's just putting together a seed guild at the moment. So she really wanted to increase the amount of grains and seeds that she's growing in her food forest. And I just thought, wow, that's really inspiring. So she's, in a completely different climate to me. She's in the US, entirely different climate, and probably a lot of what she's growing wouldn't grow in my garden. But it did make me think, oh, I wonder what grains I can add to my garden. So I've got some grain amaranth growing now in the garden as kind of my little experiment to see how that goes.
What other
If we keep up
grains
with
could you
this,
add into a food forest? Have you heard?
well, I think, I mean, she's growing things like peanuts, which
Mm.
I just couldn't grow here. But, even things like sunflowers or growing certain squash for saving the pumpkin seeds, growing, as I say, the amaranth.
Mm.
You can eat the grain off Good King Henry. I think when you start to sit down and think about all the different
Yeah.
options, there's a lot more than I had thought, actually.
Yeah.
And even saving seeds. So I'm saving a kale at the moment, some seeds of kale, and I don't really need that many to have enough kale seeds to grow for the next 10 years. I don't need that many, but actually I thought, well, what if I save these seeds, the rest of the kale seeds for doing microgreens? That's like another yield that I can save the seeds for that,
Yeah,
So
fabulous.
yeah, so it's been really interesting. I think thinking more and more about food insecurity has made me think, well, maybe in the past I've been happy to mostly just get greens and fruit from my food forest. Actually, now what more staple crops can I grow? How can I integrate potatoes in there? How can I grow more Jerusalem artichokes and
Yeah.
things that actually have a bit more substance? And I'm trying sweet potatoes for the first time
Mm.
this year. They're not really very reliable in where I live, but if this heat wave carries on, maybe I'll get a decent crop. Not that I would rather not have the heat wave and have a rubbish crop of sweet potatoes, but if I'm going to get one good thing out of all this hot weather,
But
at
I
least
think
maybe
it's
it might be some.
really interesting to think about that when you try and map out, it's not just greens or fruit. Like what are all those other things? And
Mm,
from spices to medicines to nuts to even some barks and things, and then
yeah.
the roots. We've got things like cassava and taro and all those different things, and then the climbing beans that are
Mm,
like 7-year beans, the Madagascar beans. So you get the protein. So you're trying to look at, grains and proteins and nuts and seeds, all different sorts of things. And
mm,
it's really kind of exciting when you start to map it out and see what's possible. Someone was talking earlier around, oh yes, fragrant plants. Yes, beautiful. Even plants
mm,
that have sound as well. I love it when you kind of go through and
mm,
there's, very gentle sound of different leaves moving or the rustling of bananas. I mean, bananas, you can make so many things from bananas, all the
mm,
different parts of bananas. Someone was asking earlier around about issues around possums and things. And so, when you start growing a garden and you've probably got your own things that how have you been seeing that conversation going in your community, international community, around how to protect a young food forest to get it to the point where it's robust enough?
Yeah, well, I get that all the time. My very first food forest I was growing in a field, surrounded by woodland, and I just had deer coming in all the time, eating everything. And so eventually we just had to put up like an 8 foot fence around the entire plot because that was the only way that we could keep them out. We decided, that was our decision to make that investment to put up this giant fence. And then we found that the fence was great for keeping the deer out, but the rabbits were still getting in and they were eating, ring barking all the trees. So then we had to go back and try and make it really rabbit proof. And then a farmer accidentally let his sheep in, and that, so there's just, yeah, sometimes it feels like you're just constantly fighting things that are trying to destroy your food forest. What I say quite often is if you're trying to start a new patch, and I tend to start, particularly if it's a large scale, I mean, gardens is a bit easier because they tend to be, enclosed anyway, so you get less large pests. But on a large scale, I tend to say actually just start in one patch, start a patch and just fence off that patch if that's what you need to do. And then when that patch is established, you can move that fence and then you can establish the next patch. And by doing that and moving it around, that is how I found the most successful way to establish where pests are a real problem. And sometimes, they are a really big problem and they literally eat everything, everything that you put in, they just destroy, and that can become really hard work. We have a lot of cats where we live now. We didn't used to have that, and that's been really frustrating, with them eating the birds that were fledging in the garden. That's felt quite distressing this year with the amount of cats around. But there's not any realistic way that I can keep cats out of my garden. They just are part of the ecosystem here now in a pretty on the suburban area. But yeah, and I find it quite interesting as well when people ask about, because I don't net anything, how do you stop things eating your crops? And I say, well, actually, well, I'm happy for them to share my crops. Yes, if you have a farm and your livelihood depends on black currants, maybe you might want to put some kind of control in there. But I always say I just grow more than I need, and therefore I have enough to share. Because this my garden, yes, I bought this garden, in our human habitat. I now own this because I paid for it and a bit of paper says I own it. But to a bird or a slug or a mouse, they don't understand those boundaries, and it's just as much their land as it is mine. So I try where possible to just accept that they are part of my food forest, they're part of the ecosystem, and even things like caterpillars on my cabbages, actually, well, they're part of the ecosystem as well. And if I didn't have caterpillars on my cabbages, what would the birds eat? What would the wasps eat? And that all of these things, you don't want to have a garden that's got no pests in it, because pests are part of the food chain. And so if you didn't have pests, then something else would be missing out.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And there's a question too about snails, and someone saying, I don't have big things eating, but I have little things like snails eating. And then someone else has said, snails are food too. So how have you managed the snail issue mostly? Because I know that's always a big question, snails and slugs.
Yeah. Yeah. So we mostly seem to have slugs where we are. We don't seem to have quite as many snails here. And I do think that it varies. So there can be some years where I feel like, because I remember when I was first learning about permaculture, and one of the tutors who was teaching me was like, "Oh, if your garden is healthy and happy, you don't have a slug problem because they just get eaten by everything." And I think that's a lovely way to look at it, but I don't really think that that is how it really is. Like in nature, there are years where something is more abundant than others, and there are these natural swings in populations. And so some years where it's really wet and it's ideal conditions for slugs and snails, then you'll get them breeding more and there'll be more of them, and they might be a problem in your garden. And other years, like this year, it's really hot and dry and I haven't had any slug problems whatsoever. And so there are these swings in populations. And yes, when something gets out of control and they are eating all of my crops, then I will go and I will go with a head torch at night, every night for sort of 3 or 4 nights, and I will pick them off. And, everyone has different methods. Some people take them miles away to, somewhere wild where they can empty a bucket of snails out and let them run free. Everyone has their own way of doing it, but I will go and I will hunt for them and for 3 or 4 days in a row, and I feel that, but only on my vegetables. I don't, wherever, if they're in my food forest, just kind of on apple tree, they're fine. I'm not gonna, I don't want, my goal is not to entirely clear my garden of slugs and snails. It's just that sometimes, if I don't reduce the population a bit, I won't have any crops, and then I'm not resilient
And I
anymore.
think that's kind of the benefit of the food forest as a food system, isn't it? Because it's far more resilient. There's far more growing, so you don't kind of notice. A little bit might get lost, but there's so much more in that system. Gosh, Pippa, I realise we've come to the top of the hour already. We've been chatting so much. We haven't invited anyone to come and ask questions. I have been keeping an eye on the chat and sort of trying to weave your comments and questions in as we go. But I wonder if there's any really pressing question that anyone would like to ask Pippa right now. I did want to say too that you are very welcome, everyone, to join in on Wild and Kind WhatsApp group that's still going on since the festival. There's lots of conversations going on there. So I will send out a link to that when I send out the replay to this. And also just to say, I've been dropping in the link to Pippa's forest garden, food forest circle, sorry. And that's a way where you can continue to stay in touch with Pippa and be part of that global community that is her circle. So I would love for you to continue to be in conversation, everyone who's here, if you'd like to, and to keep asking questions and to keep sharing your experience. Roland is here, and just to finish off, I'd like to give Roland maybe a minute just to talk about her project. So these Wild and Kind events are free and available for everyone to join, and we invite you to donate a small amount as you come in, and this money has been going 100% to Wild and Kind projects in various parts of the world, one of those being Roland's. And she's also just been given an opportunity to get some matching funding by Ma Earth. And so I'd love to just invite Roland, if you wouldn't mind, just to jump in for a minute, if you could. Where are you? Let me find you. There we are. Hang on. I'm going to add a pin to you. There we are. Hello.
Hi everyone.
So Roland is based in Nakivale Refugee Settlement in Uganda. And so Roland, can you just, in the quickest way possible, tell us what the project is and how they can connect in and find out more?
Thank you so much. In the quickest way possible, my name is Ansima Chasinga Roland, and I live in Uganda. I'm a Congolese by nationality, but I'm living here as a refugee, and I'm one of Morag's students. I've been practicing permaculture and teaching it also in my community since when I met her in 2022, 2021, and I took the permaculture design course and the teacher's course also. So we've been doing this in our community with children and women and everyone in the community, but we didn't have a place to be doing like our learning center for all the learnings and all the practical work in our main garden where we can all be meeting and doing the work. But last year we got the chance, and the local government gave us a land, and we were also able to get a grant to build. But now we need support to kind of bring the communities together and build the garden, and also have support to start doing more permaculture trainings to the community and all the other trainings and sessions that we do, which are very many. And you can see them on our website. I think Morag can help us do it. Yeah, Afshan. Yeah, I met Afshan in Malawi earlier this year. So we were lucky to be selected for a matching grant from Ma Earth, which means we have a possibility to gain funding, but we need people to vote for our project. We need people who trust in our work to vote for our project, and then that's how we unlock the funding as time goes by. So we are able to unlock up to $16,000, and we need people to donate any amount of money you have, and this is going to be unlocking the matching grant depending on the number of the people and any amount that you are able to donate for our project. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland. And just to say, so that link that I've dropped in there is where you can read more about the project. And essentially, even if you can donate, $1, $2, $5, $10, the more people that donate, the more money that this matching fund will give it. And also we're putting in the money from the Ethos Foundation in there, which means that all the money you've donated for these is going to get amplified and doubled or maybe even tripled because of this matching funding. So thank you so much, Roland. Just also to say that this ends on the 21st of July, this particular Mar Earth funding. So it's a really critical time. If you have anything that you could donate and support Roland, this is going to really transform the whole community and project and create food forest gardens and women's projects, as she was saying. So yeah, thank you, Roland. Lovely to see you. I am going to just then thank you, Pippa, so much for being here, for really exploring deeply what it means to create beautiful, simple, small-scale, rich, biodiverse food forests that are just some of the most magic habitats for humans as well. So thank you so much. And I hope people will stay in touch with you via your Food Forest Circle. One thing we didn't mention are your books. Maybe if you could just hold them up, because I did drop in a link earlier to the books. Let me just find them again here. So if you just want to describe them while I find the link and drop it in the chat for you.
So my first book, The Plant Lover's Backyard Forest Garden, that was all about growing a small-scale food forest in my yard and how people could do that themselves. And then I had loads of people who came to me afterwards and said, what we want is we just want some example designs so that we can get inspiration, because we've read your book and we love the idea, but we don't know where to start. So then I wrote permaculture planting design. So they're not all food forests in that they don't all have trees in, but they are all using the kind of food forest ecology ideas. And so that it's got a few chapters about how to follow the design process in a really kind of fun, accessible, not technical at all way. And then it has 12 example designs. So there's things like a family-friendly food forest. So you could just let small kids in there to pick whatever they want, because everything's edible. There's nothing dangerous in there. To tropical style food forest. So for people who just want something that looks completely different to a normal food forest, there's things with sort of big leaves and that look kind of quite tropically. And then there's some healing gardens as well. So there's a herbal tea garden, a skincare garden. So there's all sorts of different designs in there. And it was so much fun, creating all the designs for that. I just wanted to say, as well as the community, I've got a YouTube channel as well called Pippa Chapman Permaculture, if anyone wants to watch, take a watch of some of those videos as well.
I did drop the link for that up. I'm going to grab that again. There's a podcast. Anyway, I will send everyone the links for everything, and there's a podcast and there's website and books. The books can be accessed through Permanent Publications, which is also the Permaculture magazine, Folk. Mm-hmm. All of the links I will share through, and also I will share the link to Roland's campaign as well. So again, thank you. Thank you, Pippa. It's so great to see you again.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure, and you always ask such interesting questions. So it's always a pleasure to chat with you.
Yeah, well, hopefully I might see you in a couple of months. I'm heading back over UK in August, September sometime.
Oh, exciting, yeah.
Yeah, great.
Get in touch.
Well, thank you everyone for being here. It's so wonderful to have your company. Please come back next week. We're doing a session on deep ecology, and then the final of our Wild and Kind Wednesdays in 2 weeks' time around urban mycology. So thank you again, Pippa. It's really great to see you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Pippa. Thanks, Morag.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
And good
Bye,
luck, Roland,
everyone.
with your
Thank you.
project. I hope it goes well.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Take care, everyone. Bye.